just so again, welcome everyone. So this is the first of 4 reflections on the theme of righteous anger, which is being co-organized between Center for Ignatian Spirituality and the Living Stones community in Malta. Just a few words on the topic. Of course, the first word that grabs your attention is anger. It's anger is a very powerful emotion, and one that is not always understood, and in fact is very often resisted. And in everyday life, we see it as that emotion that clouds our better judgment and leads us to hurt others if we lash out. So, of course, it is also a notion that's resisted in the spiritual context. While the Christian Bible does have examples of God's anger, this anger is in many cases seen through the lens of human vengeance, perhaps, and is maybe even seen, I could say, as a source of embarrassment after Christ's call to turn the other cheek in the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, I would even go so far to say that Christians, and here perhaps I could go for Catholics in particular, have been conditioned to think of anger only as a sin. And in a particularly graphic example, Dante dedicates the 5th circle of hell to the angry, the wrathful, in his Inferno, where they fight viciously on the surface of the river Styx, or lie sullen beneath the water, unable to find joy in God or man or the universe. However, the question comes up, and we really can't deny that anger at injustice, this righteous anger, can in fact be perhaps vented and directed to something positive and channeled to do good. This anger can be like blood gushing out of a simple cut. You may think it's a bad thing, but it's the way the body cleans itself out, and the first step on the path to healing. Righteous anger, in fact, can be that emotion that moves us to act for what is right. And in fact, St. Thomas Aquinas calls it the passion that moves the will to justice. There are many examples of this will to justice all over the world, but perhaps those that followed local news may be aware of many cases that seem to demand anger. Anger at a society and a state that have failed to uphold the common good and enabled those that would destroy it for their insatiable greed. We've seen our institutions corrupted, our environment ruined, our poor ignored, and lives cut short for seeking the truth, for the color of one's skin, for trusting in the safety of home, or for just being a woman. Sometimes we feel angry about the fact that not enough people are angry about all that's going on. And you, of course, thinking about these recent examples, you think that muted. So yeah, looking at these injustices, you think that they demand the passion that is mentioned by Aquinas to move to some kind of action. In fact, Christ may have told us to turn the other cheek, but he himself did not remain indifferent in the face of injustice. He had his own experience of anger that led him to expel the money changers from the temple. Beautifully illustrated by Giotto in the Scrovegni chapel in Padova, our starting point for these 4 reflections. Which brings me to today's speaker, Ms. Giulia Privitelli, an art historian and a fellow member of Pietre Vive, in fact, if I may say, much more experienced member than myself, honestly, who today will be exploring Giotto's depiction of this gospel event in the context of the life of Christ in the Scrovegni chapel. Giulia, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. I hope I can live up to that introduction now. You set it up very nicely. Thank you. And it's really nice to see such a good turnout and some familiar faces, some new ones. So, and I hope you can keep following throughout the month of February now. Anyway, so I will share my screen, of course, because we need to refer to images. And All right, I think that's working, correct? Okay. But actually, before we begin with the actual subject of this talk, I'd like to add a little bit to Thomas's introduction, because I'd like to give this talk some context, since it also happens to be the first of 4, as you know. Throughout this talk, I will be highlighting certain aspects of anger that will be unpacked further and probably with greater precision and also competence in the following talks. For example, although it's not entirely intentional, as you can see, the title of this talk might actually evoke one of David Attenborough's recent documentaries on environmental tipping points. You know, a terrifying situation that humankind is facing, perhaps like never before, really, and that is how to face the wrath of nature, if you will me that term. But that will actually be the subject, so environmental concerns and how we can respond to those will actually be largely the nature of the next talk by Dr. John Paul Kauki, who's also a good friend of mine. And in the same way that our actions and inactions impact the natural world in complex ways, so too, I think we can speak of mankind's provocation of the wrath of God, especially if we hold an integrated physical and spiritual view of man's divine calling of how to be in this world. But how God's anger is provoked and in turn then expressed, as understood through biblical references and sources, that will be the subject of the third talk of this series by Professor Anthony Frendo, who's also here, and I send my regards to him. And finally, the affordance of anger to bring people to a constructive rather than a destructive response and way of being and relating in this world, primarily through the counter virtue of wrath, so temperance. That will be the subject of the closing talk of this series. So what I will attempt to do here in this session is actually to present these 3 different movements of anger, as I think are manifested in Giotto's decorative program for the Scrovegni Chapel in Padova, using, of course, the scene of Christ cleansing of the temple as an anchor point. And the 3 movements will primarily be these: the provocation of anger, the expression of anger, and the tempering of anger, which actually together can be seen as a kind of process of discernment. So a retrospective, contemplative, and introspective process that leads to conversion, okay, towards the fullness of life. So, and this is, of course, the scene that we will be talking about. So it is not really of little importance that the Scrovegni Chapel, which is the one you can see right now on your screens, is actually dedicated to the Annunciation of the Virgin. That is, it explicitly recalls that great moment in history, in human history at least, which reveals that mankind has this freedom to choose to receive the fullness of life, to be kind of an active witness of this union between the divine and the bodily, and indeed is invited to participate in this moment. And actually, the medieval cognition of the world already expresses a unity between matter and spirit. And this is the cognition, this medieval outlook, which was actually inherited by Giotto and his contemporaries. So this is the background against which Giotto is working. Furthermore, one of the most influential and radicalizing religious heresies, which arose at the time, the Catharism, it's called, or Albigensians, the Albigensian heresy, this arose in the 13th century, okay, it had quite a significant role to play in necessitating this urgent reform and response in the Western Church, particularly through new and very highly influential religious orders, among them the Franciscans and the Dominicans. This heresy, essentially what it was, the whole ethos of this heresy actually was that it was based on a dual conception of the universe as good, that which is related to the spirit, and evil, that which is related to matter, the earth, and anything related to the body, including emotive display. All right, so humans were taught to be spirits, really trapped in physical bodies, and must therefore be liberated or purified of all that is earthly and material. And the heresy had several implications that threatened fundamental doctrines of the church, such as the incarnation and resurrection. The sacraments also were under threat, the Eucharist, baptism, marriage. So basically the carnal and spiritual union, which in theological discourse actually is beautifully summarized in the image of the temple. Okay, so the great mission of the Franciscans as well as the Dominicans was precisely to advocate the importance and dignity of the body in man's path to God. And Saint Francis himself, as probably you know, allegedly received his mission from this animated San Damiano crucifix to rebuild my church, no? And although this actually might at first seem to align with the rejection of the Albigensians, that is the rejection of materialism, the spirituality of Saint Francis and the Franciscans was actually very, very different, that while they admonished the excessiveness, they did not renounce matter, but indeed rejoiced within it. I mean, it is enough to think of the canticles and poetic prayers, such as Laudato Si, for example, which incidentally, as you also know, inspired the name of Pope Francis's own encyclical, focusing on the relation between man and creation, also called Laudato Si. So as a mendicant order, the Franciscans were directly in touch with the world, okay, with the poverty, suffering, and injustices afflicted upon the people they encountered. So true to this, the Franciscan spirituality emphasized meditations. I have some here images actually. So they emphasized meditations that brought to mind the great suffering and passion and moments of great emotive and psychological value in the life of Christ and the Virgin. For example, in guidebooks such as Soy de Bonaventura's Meditaciones, we are actually invited to feel present, as you can read here, to feel present in those places as if things were done in your presence. Or in another instance, in Ludolf of Saxony's Vita Christi, we are invited to imagine yourself present at the time when the Passion happened. Or we can add really any other scene of great emotional or physical expression, really and truly. And probably to those among you here familiar with the Ignatian spiritual exercises, this will also bring to mind the method of contemplation or the composition of the scene, that is to observe one's actions, reactions, and responses to any given scene. And this serves as an aid to one's discernment. So really and truly, what does all this have to do with Giotto and the frescoes of the Scrovegni chapel? Well, earlier I referred to the temple as that beautiful image or analogy of the union between body and spirit, between human and divine. The temple, in this sense, allows one to be with the sacred, to be with God. So with this background in mind, it will be easier, I think, or I hope rather, to consider Giotto's fresco of the cleansing of the temple as a challenging image which brings us face to face with the question, so what really provokes the anger of God? Or to be more precise, what provokes the anger of Christ, whose person embodies the union of human and divine? And my simple, but I hope not simplistic, answer to all of this will actually be this: the deviation from what is good. Okay, but now I will unpack this a bit more. So already in the Old Testament, which, as was mentioned earlier, this will actually be the subject of the third talk. Already in the Old Testament, we find several instances in which a turning away from God provoked divine anger. For example, here I'll read one example of these three. We read in 1 Kings chapter 11, the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord. But this turning away, which is like a keyword, which will keep coming up, this turning away is not exclusive to God, but it implies a turning away from the purpose for which things were created. That is essentially from rendering thanks or giving praise to God. Think again of St. Francis's Laudato Si, okay, where everything in creation can praise God. Therefore, the provocation of an angered response is ingratitude, okay, ingratitude. And connected to this turning away from one's purpose and divine calling, which is to be in relation with each other and with creation, as rulers are with their subjects, okay? Though it's not any kind of ruler in this case, or king, but a ruler who is made in the image of a just ruler, that is God. So this deviation from the good and from the purpose for which things were created would imply a certain forgetfulness and abandonment in the sense of giving up, which is another way of saying to suffer from a sense of despair and hopelessness. Firstly, we have to say that a just ruler or just rulers do not forget or abandon their subjects or creation, that is. So they do not abandon the way things are. So to be aware of the way things are is also to be aware of the nature of things as having been created as good, as we read in Genesis chapter 1, of course. And being forgetful of this implies that thanks cannot be given for the way things were created. So forgetfulness, therefore, is, as we would say, a bedfellow of ingratitude. And the reasoning goes that when one is ungrateful, one also cannot serve the other. One cannot be obliged to the other. Think of the word obrigado in Portuguese, for example, which means both thank you and also I am at your service. It implies the same thing. And to not be able to serve, that is to give one's time or one's life to the other, is essentially to be without purpose. In a sense, it is to be without hope. So what is really at stake here when one forgets is not only the life of the other, but also of one's own life. So what we can say at this point is that the anger of God in this analysis is actually directed towards what is anti-creative. But one word of caution here, that what is destructive is not necessarily anti-creative, okay? So what is destructive is not necessarily anti-creative. And as we shall see, and as maybe we can already begin to understand in a theological sense, destruction, death, and sacrifice can actually lead to creation. They can be life-giving, okay? But we'll see this shortly. So this context can be understood, as we said, in the Old Testament, there are several instances that speak of God's anger, okay? But that man is made in the image of God also implies that man too can be angry, no? So from a simple observation really of the world around us, or even a recollection of recent news, and also introspectively reflecting about our own actions, we can deduce some of the main provocations of man's own anger. Injustice, as that which appears to be a deviation from what is good, according to us at least. For example, betrayal, fraud, lies, crimes, especially crimes against the innocent, okay? And in the Scrovegni chapel, we can also see an instance here of man's anger here in the figure of Saint Peter, who's on the left side, Saint Peter's anger in the Garden of Gethsemane. I'll get into this also later. And in another instance, I think man gets also angry at not being heard or seen, that is to say, of being ignored, or another way of saying being forgotten or abandoned. So to be forgotten or abandoned and betrayed provokes the anger of man. And of course, there are here resonances, echoes of what we just said about the anger of God, no? But the difference is that man is susceptible, as we know, to a distortion of this anger, which is manifested in how that anger is then expressed. That is, as something which is truly destructive, in the sense of being anti-creative and life-denying. So in the same way that an image, idea, or even information can be false and therefore harmful, so too can the expression of anger. So we have to be careful, basically. And to amend this, we have to look towards the figure of, towards the example of Christ as God and man, so as the perfect model, to understand how human anger can be justified, or rather ordered, so that it serves the good, so that it may be transformative and life-giving rather than anti-creative or life-denying. And to reflect on this and also on Giotto's frescoes, or what they seem to suggest at least, I will refer to John's Gospel for the description of the cleansing of the temple, even though, mind you, it is also recorded in all of the synoptics. So in all the Gospels, this is recorded, and this testifies to the importance of this moment as well. So in John's Gospel, we read as follows. This is the description of the cleansing of the temple. So when the Jewish Passover was near, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. So the relation between anger and justice through the act of cleansing or purification is actually brought out even further in the allusions to the Last Judgment, which, as the doctors of the church assert, is carried out by the second person, that is Jesus Christ. So in a sense, therefore, the expulsion from the Temple of Jerusalem can be read almost analogously together with the expulsion from the temple, that is the body of Christ, the kingdom of God. So in Giotto's fresco, we can see that the scene occurs in front of the temple of the Lord, which in light of the context of the end of time is analogous to the kingdom of God. And here we can, Giotto seems to be nodding towards this analogy of the Last Judgment. There is, for example, if you look at the image, a clear distinction between the blessed on the right of Christ and the condemned or admonished on the left. Okay, and as we read, for example, this time from Matthew chapter 25, we read, he will place the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. On his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. In fact, in the image, the sheep, the cow, and the children are on the right of Christ, so our left, and the goat is on his left, our right. Okay. Curiously, the goat also carries allusions to the vice furore, or fury or wrath, as we see here, for example, in the depiction of bad government in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, which was painted by the Lorenzetti brothers, who were incidentally also contemporaries of Giotto. And of course, for those of you who were present, I think 2 years ago now, for the talks also organized by the Center of Ignatian Spirituality, the talk was on the series of talks was on good and bad government and the common good. And we obviously made reference to these images. But furthermore, to return back to Giotto's fresco or decorative program for the Scrovegni chapel, this image of the goat devil is repeated again in the adjacent scene to that. So the adjacent scene to the cleansing of the temple, in the scene showing the betrayal of Judas, which is this one that you can now see on your screens. And here is a close-up of it. But we will actually return to the significance of the placement of these two scenes, one next to the other, shortly as well. So we can say that in this context, Christ's anger is provoked really by the restriction of man's freedom to be with God. So a freedom which is restricted by money, so by material and finite things, that is used in an oppressive and almost tyrannical way. And this, as a result, closes one's heart. And it would seem at first that we are here on the side of the Albigensians, actually, remember the heresy, who posit that matter and all things material are bad or lead to what is not good in one's approach to the divine. But the argument that I'm trying to make here is actually that money itself is not bad. In fact, it can lead to good things like creating this space, this chapel itself, where you actually do need money to create it. But it can become problematic when it does not allow that approach, when it restricts man's freedom to approach and be with the sacred. So money here, in this case, is made the judge of whether one can enter into relation with God, and not love. So it replaces love, it displaces love, and therefore also the free-willed desire to know the truth, to be with God. So in this sense, the money exchangers were desacralizing or deconsecrating the temple. And Christ's angered response acts upon this broken relationship, rupturing so as to create a certain openness as a counter to the closure and the exclusion, which is caused by greed and envy, etc. And this purification and restoration of an open or empty space to be filled by love, I think, is what is actually at the heart of the entire decorative program of the Scrovegni chapel. Indeed, the entire artistic endeavor and the very sometimes unorthodox selection of scenes for this chapel may actually have been undertaken as a response for this need of purification, the need for cleansing of the patron's own name from scandal and illicit financial activity. It might sound a bit familiar also in our Maltese context, right? So some scholars have actually suggested that the scene of the cleansing of the temple, which is here where you have number 8, is also linked to the family, so the Scrovegni family's own dubious increase in wealth. And keep in mind that such a fraudulent activity at the time was considered pretty much to be a direct insult to God. And John, here are some close-ups, and John Chrysostom, for example, writes, more cursed than all merchants is the usurer, for he sells a thing not bought, as do the merchants, but given by God. So this is a grievous, grievous sin, according to John Chrysostom. And it is also for this reason, perhaps, that Dante actually had the audacity to place Enrico Scrovegni, Enrico Scrovegni's own father, actually, Reginaldo degli Scrovegni, in the final round of the 7th circle of hell in Canto 17, so quite down there, you know, and the Commedia Divina. And in Giotto's frescoes, there might be some of this underlying commentary in the unusual and prominent placement of the scene portraying the betrayal of Judas, as you can see here, on the triumphal arch. This is what this arch in the middle is called, following, however, the cleansing of the temple, okay? And beside the visitation scene, which you can see on the right, where Mary visits Elizabeth. So it possibly highlights the sin of usury and these illicit means of making money for which the Scrovegni were actually accused of. Although why Enrico Scrovegni would want really to bring attention to an accusation, that can also actually be rightly questioned, you know. But in any case, the emphasis on the evils that can be brought by money is palpable throughout the entire program. In the Last Judgment, as you can see here, for example, we see Enrico Scrovegni kneeling before the Virgin, presenting a model of the same chapel, and this is then contrasted with the hanged figure of Judas, a symmetry which was, as we saw, which was exactly in front of it, the figure of Judas at least. And this symmetry is not unlike the one we actually do read in Dante's epic poem. Recall also that the scene of the cleansing of the temple employs a composition which invokes the Last Judgment, as we have seen. And so the link is not necessarily coincidental or without any theological bearing, actually. And furthermore, again in the Last Judgment scene, we see hanged men or people hanging from strings of money bags. And this we read again in Dante in Canto 17 in his Inferno. Usurers are described with money bags around their necks, okay? So what I am hinting at here is that the response towards unjust claims, which provoke anger, can lead actually to an act of creation, even literally by creating art, okay? So rather than destruction. But before we develop this idea a bit more, I think it is important now that we turn to this next part of the talk about expressing anger. Focusing really on how that anger is portrayed and consequently expressed. To be sure, the main ethos of my argument is that the expression of anger may in fact serve as a means of purification, renewal, and even creation. It is I think, in a sense, different to the question regarding the portrayal of anger as such. That is how anger is portrayed in art. Of course, one can view the cleansing of the temple as a portrayal of anger, as much as it can be, in contemplation, considered an expression of anger. And in my view, Giotto actually gives us two ways of experiencing this anger in the Scrovegni chapel. That is as portrayal and as expression. Okay, so we have, for example, this abstracted, though figurative, portrayal of anger in the personification of ira, anger or wrath. In the corridor, which is the part beneath where people stand in the Scrovegni chapel, the corridor of the vices and the virtues at the bottom section of this entire decorative program. And this is where people walk. This is where people are. Here in this image, as you can see, ira is portrayed as that state which leaves one empty. The breasts, okay, the exposed breasts revealed by the personification of anger, they are empty. There is no life, and nor can it be, in this sense, life-giving. So it is, in a sense, a closed and empty state. You know, as portrayal, this representation of anger, of ira, invites us then to draw a contrast with the expressed anger of Christ in the temple, which is above it in the decorative program. It forces us to question Christ's anger in contrast to the bitter anger of Judas. Therefore, we would ask, which of the two expressions leads to destruction, or which one leads to creation? Okay, so we're, as people observing these scenes, we are questioning, we are invited to question all of these kind of relations. And meanwhile, facing this image of ira, of anger, we have the figure then of temperancia, or temperance. And above this virtue of temperance, we have scenes showing the expression of impulsive anger. So, for example, down there you can see temperancia, and above it, Christ washing the feet of the apostles, and next to that, a moment of impulsive anger where Saint Peter attacks the high priest's servant, who, if I recall correctly, his name is Malchus, which also means king. And we know the story, how the story continues in this scene, and Christ's response to Peter's impulsive anger. He asks him, "Shall I not drink from this cup?" So one would think, actually, contrasting these scenes, that there is a lack of consistency between Christ's own actions in the cleansing of the temple, and then his corrective response in the opposite scene. But the scenes confront each other so as to bring these different attitudes in dialogue with one another. The viewer, placed between ira, anger, and temperancia, or temperance, is invited to contemplate the position one ought to take before any given situation. Even if a situation seems more grievous, for example, upfront betrayal, and would naturally elicit a kind of angry response. Yet it does not necessarily imply that it is, in fact, a righteous form of anger, even though it elicits that response within us. So, in the sense, this is not dissimilar either to the reader's experience of Dante's Divine Comedy, again, to bring him into the debate, because he there witnesses Dante Pilgrim, the reader witnesses along with Dante Pilgrim these different states and nuances of anger. For example, in Canto 7 of Inferno, we meet the souls of those whom anger overcame. Here, the ram of the angry follows wealth actually. The canto opens up in the realm of Plutus, who is the classical god of wealth. And this is significant in our case, or in the context of the Scrovegni chapel, because, as we have said, the patron was troubled by accusations of usury directed against his family. And based furthermore on a Thomistic explanation of Aristotle's categorization of anger in the Nicomachean Ethics, whom Dante referred to constantly, Dante first encounters one kind of anger in the beginning, which is a choleric kind of anger, that is an impulsive form of anger, where the sin is not that of violence, but of intemperance. So choleric is something that makes you act impulsively. And the second form of anger that Dante encounters in this canto is actually that of the amari, or the bitter. That is, those who bottle up their anger and suffer within, without expressing it so. So we can contrast this to the anger of those who vent their anger quickly. Remember the scene of Saint Peter attacking Marcus. So according to this reading of anger, that is according to the Thomistic explanation or Aristotle's Ethics, the third set is that of a hostile form of anger. It's intentional, which is kind of bent over cold-blooded revenge, and is associated with violence and causing physical harm to the other. And in Dante's Inferno, this is actually grouped with later on with the sins of violence and features in a later canto, in Canto 12. But as we can already see by now, anger per se is much more nuanced and complex, and may be actually portrayed in many different and sometimes even contradictory and surprising ways. It even, in Dante's case, it even anger finds its place in purgatory, in purgatorio, that is, in the approach towards paradise. Apologies. And what this part of the poem, that is in Purgatorio, what this part of the poem tells us about anger is that anger becomes utterly destructive and agonizing when a person is unable to express it in a measured way. Okay, that is, it is either too quick, the expression is either too quick or completely silenced. So anger has to be expressed for it not to become destructive, but transformative. It should be lived and embodied. Okay, it is an invitation to embody, to make present before the eyes and the body, to contemplate the portrayal of anger as if one were physically present before the scene, recalling what Bonaventura suggests in the Meditationes, or Ludolfo Flaxini in the Vita Christi, for example. So in placing oneself before this portrayal of anger in a mode of contemplation is actually then to talk also of an expression of anger, or the discernment of this expression. And therefore it is not simply its portrayal, okay? So portrayal both reflects and may lead to expression, but it is actually expression which can ultimately be transformative. And we shouldn't overlook the fact that Dante introduces anger in purgatory, in Canto 16 to be precise, and so in the place of purification, and he places it more or less at the midway point of the entire poem, where those repenting their wrath have to measure their pace. You know, that is, they ought to find a balance between walking too quickly or too slowly through the thick smoke, as we read in that canto. Back to the Scrovegni chapel, the placement of the episode of the cleansing of the temple, as we read also in John's Gospel, is actually inserted at the beginning in John's Gospel, Chronologically, Giotto seems to be following the other Gospels, okay, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But theologically, he follows John in the sense that the cleansing of the temple serves as a turning point of the story of salvation. And quite literally too, because as you can see, one has to physically turn his body to view the next scenes. So this is turning, okay? To view the next scenes which set off the story of Christ's Passover, which begins at the bottom of these three tiers. So it is also significant, I think, that in the synoptics, this episode comes at a turning point between the teachings and the passion of Christ. In Matthew, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, we are bombarded by a series of angry warnings. Most significant, for example, are the woes of the scribes and the Pharisees. And here you can see an image, a still image taken from the angry Christ as represented in Pasolini's Il Vangelo secondo Matteo. It's a beautiful film. And so Christ's anger in the cleansing of the temple may, in a sense, be seen as this intended awakening, a purging from what truly may lead to an exclusion from the temple, that is the kingdom of God. So anger, therefore, as both Giotto and Dante show us, cannot be read in isolation, just like how each fresco scene must be read in conjunction with the other scenes within the place or within the space. It will serve us well, then, to dwell on what we call juxtapositioning, the placement of one scene next to the other. The placement of, that is, the anger of Christ in this case, so the anger of Christ as the ultimate scapegoat, within the larger narrative of salvation and this quest for truth, in order to understand the essential difference between the expressed anger of Christ and then that of the crowd. And this scene, that is that of the cleansing of the temple, as I have mentioned also before, is to be read in light of the betrayal. That is in light of the betrayal of Judas. And so in light of the contrast between the receiving and delivering of Christ through self-gain, and possibly also bitter anger. So the handing over of the self, the betrayal of Judas, handing over the self. And that handing over of the self, that betrayal, is to be contrasted then with the reception and the delivery of Christ to posterity in love and submission to God. That is in the Annunciation scene, and also in the visitation or the reception of Elizabeth of Mary, who was pregnant with Christ. So this movement, in a sense, is also the movement from the woe, from the betrayal, to the blessing, to the Annunciation. So the movement is from self-gain to self-giving, from death to life. Okay, this is the movement that one makes. And the gap between the betrayal and the visitation becomes really palpable, and it becomes perhaps part of the meaning, as does the surprising and unorthodox selection of scenes, which are clearly intended to be read together and to evoke a specific meaning in their being read together in such a prominent part of the chapel, as a confrontation of meaningful opposites, as some scholars put it. And I remind you, this is this part of the chapel where you have the triumphal arch is the first thing you immediately see as you walk inside the space. Okay, so it's directly in front of you. So this expression of anger, again, draws attention to what needs conversion and renewal. So what needs to receive life? Anger, therefore, is provoked by what actually is, but also may be expressed so as to point towards what is possible. Anger, in other words, carries the seed of hope. And I like to quote Saint Augustine at this point, because allegedly he has a saying where he writes or says that hope has two beautiful daughters, so anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are. So the call to action through expressed anger is actually a call for conversion. That is to say, to turn towards the good, God, not simply as a kind of as a forewarning of Christ's judgment or second coming, the last judgment again, but as a kind of advent, enunciation, a kind of advent. So an active participation in what already is possible by virtue of the incarnation, the cross and the resurrection. Or as Dante would put it, he would say la vita nuova, the new life, okay? So this is to move on to the next part and to recapitulate a bit what I've been trying to say. Previously, we saw how this deviation from what is good, or rather the failure to remember the presence and faithfulness of God, and therefore the good, provokes the anger of God, okay? I also mentioned how this failure to remember, is actually a precursor to ingratitude. And ingratitude, in turn, is the inability to remember, to image and to conceive in the mind, to imagine and conceive in the mind, literally to think. And the Germanic word actually it itself indicates the relationship between thinking and thanking, thinking and gratitude, denken. No, ingratitude, in other words, is also, in a sense, the inability to know. And again, Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, he writes that the gentle-tempered person is not vengeful, but inclined to sympathetic understanding. And it is not a coincidence then that anger, or seeing red, as we say in English, it does not permit one to know. And recall how Christ's plea to the Father on the cross was, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. So to have a tempered anger is to know and see what one does. As it were, the divine and righteous response to the situation of ingratitude, of disservice and of not knowing, is actually to make out of Christ this ultimate and lasting sign of God's presence, which is what in the history of the Jews, and even ours in a way, always comes under threat. No, the threat of doubt and the lack of faith, actually. So it is to make Christ the lasting sacrifice through his incarnation, the crucifixion and the resurrection. It is like, if you will, a reversed Dantesque contrapasso, or Ignatius's contra agire, if you're familiar with the spiritual exercises. So God's reply to man's stubbornness and close-heartedness is to bestow mankind with the ultimate perfect model of self-giving. It itself a display of gratitude, a lesson in gratitude. In this way, anger is tempered and becomes righteous. So in Christ, and of course in the Scrovegni chapel, we see this lesson in gratitude as an expression of temperance in the scene of Christ washing the feet of the apostles, for example, which is, by the way, itself a representation of meekness. And this scene is, as I mentioned before, portrayed above the panel of Temperance, who I've been unmuted. I don't know which part you haven't heard, but I'll repeat this bit. I was just here saying that in Christ, we see this lesson of gratitude as an expression of temperance in the scene where Christ is washing the feet of the apostles, okay? Which is also above the panel showing the personification of temperance. And this, where Christ washes the feet of the apostles, also precedes, okay, the scene of St. Peter's attack on the high priest's servant, portraying impulsive anger. And of course, also the betrayal there of Judas. So this act of service or giving and restraint is contrasted by the act of taking or the act of violence and then subsequent healing. And this becomes an invitation to enter, in a sense, to enter and discern this great mystery of the love of God. And discernment also is a process which requires the practice of temperance, which takes time. Note also the word time, tempus and temperare, temperantia, they carry the same root, okay? So in a sense, it requires us to not act impulsively. This is what discernment is, to allow us to not act impulsively, so as to be able to overcome the enemy of humankind, which corrupts that righteous form of anger into ira mala, as also Dante writes in Purgatory, in Purgatorio, in Canto, I believe, Canto 17. And ira mala is a destructive form of anger. And indeed, as I mentioned, here the personification of temperance is shown wrapping this sharp blade of the dagger, which in a sense balances out that impulsivity which is divisive and harmful. But often temperantia or temperance is also represented through the outpouring from one vessel to the other, an expression of a sense of balance and proportion and measure, temperare. And this is what fills rather than what leaves one empty. So temperance, in other words, does not take away so as to leave empty, but it is a passing over into what is empty. So it's the exact opposite, in a sense, of ira. And it is also in the sense that temperance is creative, since it enables life to flourish by bringing order to things, which is essentially another way of describing the act of discernment, that is, to put order to things, no? And again, the placement of scenes one next to the other, the viewing of frame by frame in the context of a whole, is also a sense, in a sense, a way of putting things in order. To read and contemplate the Scrovegni chapel is itself an act of discernment. So to reflect on the story of salvation, which is the story represented in the Scrovegni chapel, is a way of restoring that order between man and man, man and God, and man and creation, which is basically the story of new creation then. And that in itself is an act of discernment. So it is not surprising that so much attention is given to the placement of scenes in Giotto's cycle of frescoes. And this also depends on where one enters from, okay? So if one, for example, had to enter through the private door, which was used by the family, which is in this picture here at the bottom left, okay? There's like a little archway down there. That is where the private door connecting to the palace. And this would probably have been used by the patron and the family. So entering through that door, the fresco panel that sets off the entire narrative is actually that of Joachim's expulsion from the temple. Again, this is here represented at the top left. So this mirrors perhaps not only the expulsion from the temple, as we see in the cleansing of the temple, but also mirroring, I would say, and here's a detail, mirroring that of the episode of the fall of man and expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, that commonly sets of other visual narrative cycles of the time. So Joachim's expulsion from the temple and into the wilderness is a reflection of man's fallen condition and man's desolation, and the need for that recovery and salvation through God's intercession. So the story of salvation, of cleansing, of learning, so as to remember, is a process which, however, takes a lot of time. Like Dante's journey, in fact, one must descend before one begins to ascend. Or actually, as is represented here in the Scrovegni chapel, the reading of the scenes requires this three-tier descent from top to bottom, 3 rotations, until one arrives to this empty space of expectation. You see the empty chambers at the bottom. So that is where the cycle of fresco actually ends. This embodied process of learning actually brings the beholder to confront that closed emptiness that follows the destruction of bitter anger, of betrayal, of despair and envy. So basically the vices on the left side of the corridor where we stand, contrasted with that of open emptiness in the reception of life, through fortitude, love, hope, justice, temperance, all the other virtues, which are actually on the right side of the corridor in the Scrovegni chapel. As the turning point of man's salvation, the Annunciation, that is, which is at the top here of the triumphal arch, and as I remind you, is actually the main dedication of the chapel, is then this invitation to move from a closed emptiness to the open emptiness, which is able to receive life, and not any life, but paradoxically, it is the life of the cross, no? And importantly, it is not anger that is expressed on the cross, but actually something altogether different, if not surprising. Forgiveness. That is what is offered on the cross. So anger is not the last word. That's important. And this is what I hope to have been able to illustrate in this talk, that the last word, the definitive answer, cannot be anger. For anger taken to an end results in this unfillable emptiness. And whenever man's anger is made to be the last word, it is typically of a destructive and violent kind, so an empty form of anger. But we also know that man's response is not truly the last word, because the real last word is that of the ultimate scapegoat, the first and last word, who takes it upon himself to be destroyed, who takes on the consequences of man's angered response, refusing to allow man's expressed blind and untempered anger to have this final destructive end. And incredibly, Christ's last word is that of forgiveness. So Christ, as an ever creative God, offers that possibility to transform that anger into a new life. So his self-emptying, kenosis, we say, confronts the empty anger of man, transforming that resulting emptiness and desolation, which is that state of feeling like all was and is an empty promise. So transforming that desolation into what is a hopeful promise of man's liberation and salvation. And that is the awaiting, that is the adventum, the advent. So the last word, as was that of Christ, who is the model for the role and place of anger in man's life, is forgiveness, basically, which doubles as the ultimate attempt to teach gratitude, literally to forgive, to give above and beyond what one deserves. And like Christ on the cross, anger, therefore, must also be followed by some kind of receding or self-denial, the admission that basically not all is possible for man, but all is for God, and that all is possible for God. In other words, it is the acknowledgement that it is almost impossible, really, for man to be completely sovereign over anger, and alone anger, it cannot bring change, but rather, as to quote Cardinal Henry Newman says in a sermon, which is actually called The Duty of Self-Denial, he says that anger degenerates into pride, sullenness, malice, cruelty, revenge, and hatred. It will inflame his diseased soul and poison it. That is what anger is able to do alone. So in this way, anger cannot be the last word, because it is a part of a process of cleansing, of recognizing, in a sense, one's nakedness. It is a process which gives the possibility to learn, to discern, and to facilitate man's approach to God. And the distance between man and God is actually bridged through forgiveness, which is Christ. The cross, in other words. The cross is this measure of God's forgiveness, which is an expression of tempered anger. Anger, therefore, does not replace the cross, but the cross is erected precisely in the place where anger would otherwise have been. And I repeat, the injustice inflicted upon the cross does not elicit anger, an otherwise totally human reaction to injustice, but rather it elicits forgiveness. And we can also say that forgiveness acts on the original wound of man, that is, of having been separated from that divine image, of being unlike God, basically. Strangely, we often come across instances, in fact, in which forgiveness itself may elicit an angered response in a person, perhaps precisely because to be good, to be like Christ, is what is desired the most, and it is where we are the most vulnerable. Remember, for example, the story of the prodigal son, the reaction of the older brother when he sees his father forgive the young son. No, anger is elicited before forgiveness. So the prerequisite, as well as the consequence of God's righteous anger, which I have now just reframed as an expression of forgiveness, is actually humiliation. That is, mankind's need for salvation is actually the cross that man carries. Humiliation is the denial of self, not of the other, which would otherwise be a betrayal, as we have seen in Judas's example. It is that yes to the open womb, and also the promise of the empty tomb. And it is in this way too that the cross, as the response to the untempered anger of the mob, is actually a place of recognition, of discernment, and therefore, even as the then Cardinal Ratzinger once wrote, the cross is actually the birthplace of a Christian faith as a whole. And actually, coming back to the Scrovegni chapel, it is actually with the image of the cross that is the final image. This is the image that we leave, the image we leave with when we exit the Scrovegni chapel. This last word that we, with which one leaves the chapel. And it is there, really and truly, on our way out and back into the everyday life, that we make our choice. Before this image of a crisis, which is the cross, the image of a great injustice, which ought to provoke a great anger, but also it is an image of great love, which therefore ought to provoke great gratitude. And we leave with this question, will it be a yes to the cross, echoing the Virgin's yes, as in the Annunciation? And if so, in what way shall we choose to reconcile our anger and our gratitude, so that we may always turn towards what is good for all who and that we meet in our everyday life, our family, our friends, communities, the church, the world and creation itself. So to turn towards what ultimately brings us to that fullness of life. Okay, I think I conclude on that note. And thank you for listening. Of course, if there are questions or comments, I suppose we might have a bit of time for that.